The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between bills and junk mail, like it wasn't about to blow my entire life apart. My mother's familiar handwriting jumped out at me immediately, which was impossible since she'd been dead for 3 months. I stood frozen in my kitchen, the morning sunlight streaming through the window as I stared at the envelope. My daily ritual of brewing coffee, the one constant that had kept me sane since Mom's passing, momentarily forgotten. The rich aroma of French roast filled the air, a stark contrast to the coldness spreading through my chest. My name is Erin, and at 53, I thought I had my life figured out, 25 years at the same accounting firm, a recently emptied nest, and a marriage that had weathered most storms. But there I stood, my reading glasses perched on my nose, holding an envelope that shouldn't exist, while my husband Daniel's voice drifted in from the living room as he took another important call about potential job prospects, 6 months after being laid off from his engineering position. "This has to be old mail," I muttered, turning the envelope over, my fingers tracing Mom's distinctive loops and curves. The postmark was from last week. My hands started shaking, the tremor I'd developed after losing my son years ago returning with a vengeance. The sound of Daniel's footsteps made me shove the letter into the pocket of my cardigan, a reflex born from months of avoiding difficult conversations. He appeared in the doorway, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair, a nervous tell I'd picked up on years ago. At 55, Daniel still had the handsome features that had attracted me 3 decades ago, but worry lines had permanently etched themselves around his eyes, deepening with each passing week of unemployment. "Morning," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Any chance that coffee's ready?" "Just about," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady while the letter seemed to burn against my ribs through the pocket. "Any word from that engineering firm?" He poured himself a cup, the slight tremor in his hand not escaping my notice. "They're still reviewing candidates." He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Listen, I need to borrow some money from your personal account. Mom and Dad are having trouble with their mortgage again." The letter seemed to pulse against my side like a second heartbeat. This wasn't the first time we'd had this conversation in recent months. "Daniel, we talked about this. We're already stretched thin covering both our expenses since you lost your job." "It's just temporary," he insisted, that familiar defensive edge creeping into his voice. His jaw tightened the way it always did when he felt cornered. "They helped us out when we first got married, remember? When we couldn't make rent that first year?" I bit back what I really wanted to say. 3 months of temporary support was already straining our savings, but pointing that out would just lead to another argument about family loyalty and obligation, usually ending with me feeling like the villain for suggesting his parents figure out their own finances at 70-something years old. "I'll think about it," I said instead, which was our code for not really, but I didn't want to fight right now. Not with Mom's impossible letter weighing heavy in my pocket, demanding my attention. As soon as Daniel left for another networking meeting at his favorite coffee shop, his third this week with no results, I pulled out the letter with trembling fingers and began to read. "My dearest Erin, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and the timing is critical. I've arranged for this letter to be delivered 3 months after my death because I needed to be certain about something first. Check the loose floorboard in my old studio, the one by the window where you used to sit and watch me paint on Sunday afternoons. What you'll find there will explain everything. But sweetheart, be careful who you trust with this information. Sometimes the people closest to us have the most to gain from our silence. All my love, Mom." I sank into a kitchen chair, the coffee growing cold beside me, my mind racing. Mom's house, my childhood home, was sitting empty while I figured out what to do with it, or at least it was supposed to be empty. But last week I'd driven by and noticed lights on inside. I'd assumed it was just my imagination, or maybe a timer I'd forgotten about when I'd last walked through the echoing rooms filled with Mom's art and memories. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel, having dinner with Mom and Dad. "Don't wait up." I grabbed my keys before I could talk myself out of it. The drive to Mom's house took 20 minutes, each one filled with questions that multiplied like rabbits. What did she hide? Why wait 3 months? And why did her warning about trust make my stomach twist with the same dread I'd felt when I discovered Daniel's secret credit card statements last year? As I pulled up to the curb, my headlights swept across the front of the house and caught movement behind the living room curtains. Someone was definitely inside. I killed the engine and sat there, heart pounding against my ribs, as a familiar car pulled into the driveway. Daniel's car, the same one he was supposed to be taking to his parents' house across town. The porch light clicked on, and through the window I saw my mother-in-law Martha's face, clear as day, inside my mother's house. Confrontation avoided, I didn't confront them that night. Instead, I drove home in a daze, my mother's letter burning a hole in my pocket and questions burning holes in my mind. Each streetlight I passed seemed to illuminate another crack in the foundation of my marriage, casting harsh shadows over memories I'd once held dear. The house was dark and empty when I returned, the silence almost deafening. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching familiar objects, the anniversary clock Daniel had given me 15 years ago, the family photos where our smiles seemed genuine, the throw pillows Martha had insisted would brighten up the place. Everything felt different now, tainted somehow. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the empty space beside me growing colder as the hours passed. What were they doing in Mom's house? What secret was hidden beneath that floorboard? And how much of my life was built on lies I'd been too trusting, or too afraid, to see? The next morning, I got ready for work like everything was normal, following the routine I'd perfected over 2 decades. I applied my makeup with careful precision, covering the dark circles that betrayed my sleepless night. I chose my navy pantsuit, the one that made me feel powerful on days when I needed armor. I even left Daniel's coffee mug by the pot, though I knew he had already left, avoiding me as skillfully as I was avoiding confrontation. Like I hadn't caught my husband and his mother sneaking around my dead mother's house. The promotion announcement came during the morning meeting. 25 faces turned toward me as my boss beamed from the head of the conference table. I'm pleased to announce that after 25 years of dedicated service, Erin will be taking over as head of financial operations, she announced, her voice carrying across the polished wood table. No one deserves this more. Under different circumstances, this would have been the highlight of my year, hell, my decade. The culmination of years of hard work, late nights, and sacrifices. Now it felt like one more match being tossed onto an already smoldering pile of kindling, ready to ignite my carefully constructed life. My colleagues applauded. Someone brought out a cake. I smiled and thanked everyone, playing my part in this celebration while my thoughts remained trapped in the image of Martha's face in my mother's window. Daniel was waiting at home when I got back, sprawled on the couch with his laptop. His casual posture couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders or the way his eyes darted to mine and quickly away again. "How was work?" he asked, not looking up from the screen, fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on the keyboard. I set my purse down carefully, watching his reaction. "I got the promotion." His fingers stopped typing. A moment of stillness passed between us, heavy with all the things we weren't saying. "Oh." Just that one syllable, heavy with something that wasn't quite congratulations. He finally met my eyes, his expression unreadable. "Have you told Mom and Dad yet?" The question landed like a slap. "Why would I tell your parents before telling you?" He shrugged, closing his laptop. "They're coming over for dinner tonight. I thought we could celebrate as a family." My stomach clenched, a physical reaction to the mention of Martha and Richard after what I'd seen last night. "You invited them without asking me? After I worked a full day?" "Come on, Erin," he sighed, that familiar note of disappointment creeping into his voice. "They're just trying to be supportive. Dad picked up steaks from that butcher you like." 2 hours later, I was setting the table while Martha hovered in my kitchen, rearranging my spice rack to make more sense. Every time I looked at her perfectly coiffed silver hair and designer blouse, that she certainly couldn't afford on Richard's pension, I remembered her silhouette in my mother's window. My fingers tightened around the silverware, imagining the satisfaction of confronting her right here, between the salt and pepper shakers she was currently repositioning. "These should be together, dear," she said, completely oblivious to my murderous thoughts. "It's more efficient." Richard emerged from our guest bathroom, his imposing figure commanding attention as he always did. At 75, he still carried himself with the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "Noah tells us you got a promotion," Richard said from his seat at the head of my table, a spot he always claimed without asking. His tone suggested he was announcing I'd contracted a mild case of the flu. "That's quite a responsibility. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of pressure?" I placed down the last fork with perhaps more force than necessary, the clink against the table punctuating my irritation. "I've been doing most of the work already for years. The title just makes it official." Martha turned from the spice rack, wiping her hands on a dish towel as if she'd completed some essential task. "But surely, with Daniel between positions right now, you'll want to focus more on supporting him. A wife's primary duty is to her husband, after all." Her smile never reached her eyes. "Especially at your age, you should be thinking about scaling back, not taking on more stress." I caught Daniel's slight wince. He opened his mouth, probably to change the subject, but I was done playing nice. 25 years of swallowing my responses had left a bitter taste, and suddenly I couldn't stomach it anymore. "Actually," I said, setting down the water pitcher with deliberate care, "my primary duty is to my career, which is currently supporting this entire household." Dinner confrontation, the room went silent. The expensive grandfather clock in the corner, a wedding gift from Martha and Richard, ticked loudly in the sudden stillness. Richard's face darkened, his jaw clenching in that same way Daniel's did when confronted. Martha pressed her hand to her chest like I'd physically struck her, a gesture so theatrical I almost expected her to call for smelling salts. "Aaron," Daniel warned quietly, his eyes pleading. "No, let's talk about it," I continued, surprising myself with how steady my voice was. Years of presenting financial projections to skeptical executives had taught me something after all. "Let's talk about how I'm paying our mortgage, our bills, and somehow still finding money to help with your parents' expenses. Let's talk about why you were at my mother's house last night when you told me you were having dinner with them." The color drained from Daniel's face. Martha's hand dropped from her chest, and her expression shifted from shocked to calculated in an instant, like a mask being adjusted. "We were simply checking on the property," she said smoothly, "as family. We feel responsible for helping maintain it while you're dealing with your grief." I'd known Martha for 30 years, watched her manipulate situations with the precision of a surgeon, but I'd never been the direct target before. It was almost impressive. "That's interesting," I replied, refilling my wine glass with deliberate slowness, considering I never gave anyone permission to enter the house. "Daniel has a key," Richard cut in, his tone suggesting this simple fact ended all discussion. "And as your husband," Martha started. "As my husband, he has no legal right to that property," I interrupted, my voice growing sharper. "It's not in his name. It was left specifically to me." Daniel stood up suddenly, his napkin falling to the floor. "Can we discuss this later, in private?" His eyes darted between his parents and me, panic written across his features. "Why?" I challenged, setting down my glass with more force than intended. "So you can come up with better excuses?" "You're being hysterical," Martha said, her voice dripping with concern that didn't reach her eyes. "This is exactly why we worry about you taking on too much responsibility. The stress is clearly affecting your judgment." I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that seemed to startle everyone, including myself. 30 years of marriage, and they still thought they could gaslight me like I was a naive 20-something again. My judgment is just fine. In fact, it's never been clearer. I pulled my mother's letter from my pocket and placed it on the table. The cream-colored envelope sat between us like a grenade with the pin removed. Would anyone like to explain why my dead mother felt the need to warn me about trusting the people closest to me? The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel stared at the letter like it was a snake about to strike, but it was Martha's reaction that confirmed my suspicions. The flash of recognition in her eyes before she could hide it, the slight stiffening of her shoulders beneath her cashmere sweater. What exactly did you find in my mother's studio? I asked quietly, looking directly at Martha. And how long have you been looking for it? Bank statement discovery. After the disastrous dinner, I spent hours combing through our bank statements. The house was silent, Daniel having left with his parents after a tense standoff where no one had actually answered my questions. The kitchen still smelled of the steaks no one had eaten, the dishes stacked in the sink like archaeological evidence of a civilization's collapse. The truth revealed itself in a series of small withdrawals, each one a paper cut to my trust in Daniel. He'd been moving money to his parents' account for months, thousands of dollars hidden behind vague descriptions like household expenses and maintenance fees. No wonder our savings had been dwindling despite my careful budgeting. Sleep eluded me again. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, surrounded by bank statements and betrayal, watching the sun rise through the window while my 25-year marriage crumbled like sand between my fingers. The next morning, I found Daniel in the kitchen making coffee like it was any other day. The sight of him standing there, so casual in his faded t-shirt and sweatpants, coffee scoop in hand, made my blood boil. How dare he pretend everything was normal? Want to explain these transfers? I slid the printed statements across the counter, my voice morning rough but firm. He glanced at them, then away, shoulders slumping slightly. I was going to tell you. When? I asked, crossing my arms to stop myself from shaking. After you'd emptied our savings? Or when I couldn't cover the mortgage next month? He sighed, rubbing his face with both hands, suddenly looking every day of his 55 years. They needed help with their mortgage, he said, his voice taking on that defensive tone I'd grown to hate. Dad's pension isn't covering everything since the market crashed. Their investments took a hit. So you decided to secretly drain our account instead of having an adult conversation about it? My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. We've been married for 25 years, Daniel. 25 years. Because I knew you'd react like this. He slammed his coffee mug down, brown liquid sloshing over the rim onto the counter we'd picked out together during our kitchen renovation 5 years ago. You don't understand what it's like having parents who actually need you. Your mom left you that house, plus whatever she hid in that studio. His words hit me like a physical blow. My mother had battled cancer for 2 years before finally succumbing 3 months ago. I'd been there through every treatment, every setback, every moment of hope and despair while Daniel had managed to be too busy for most hospital visits. What exactly did your mother find there? I cut in, watching his face carefully, suddenly alert to the subtext beneath his words. He froze for a split second, long enough to confirm he knew something. Nothing. We were just cleaning. Cleaning what? The floorboards? The moment I said it, his eyes widened slightly. That's it, isn't it? You found my mom's letter. Somehow you knew about the loose floorboard. Harper, he stopped himself, realizing his mistake. Aaron, did you find what she hid there? Is that why you've all been sneaking around my house? Instead of answering, he pulled out his phone. I watched in disbelief as he typed out a message, his fingers moving rapidly across the screen. Are you texting your mother right now? I asked, incredulity momentarily overriding anger. She needs to be part of this conversation. His tone suggested this was perfectly reasonable. I grabbed my car keys from the hook by the door. No, she really doesn't. Where are you going? To my mother's house. I corrected myself immediately. And if I find your parents there again? They have nowhere else to go. The words exploded out of him, echoing in our kitchen. The bank foreclosed on their house 2 months ago. They've been staying at Mom's place. Shocking revelation, because it's my mother's house, I corrected coldly, my fingers tightening around the keys until the metal bit into my palm. And what exactly is Mom's place? He ran his hands through his hair, that nervous gesture I'd once found endearing. Now it just looked manipulative, a calculated move to appear vulnerable. Martha says she and your mother had an arrangement, something about shared ownership, or... I laughed, the sound harsh even to my own ears, bouncing off the granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that had once symbolized our success. My mother would never agree to that. She didn't even like Martha. That's not true. They were close. His voice rose defensively. Mom has proof. What proof? But he was already texting again, probably warning them I was coming. I left him standing there, his excuses following me out the door like desperate puppies. The spring morning was deceptively beautiful, cherry blossoms nodding in the gentle breeze, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. The drive to my mother's house felt different this time. Every memory of the past few months shifted like puzzle pieces rearranging themselves into a new, disturbing picture. Noah's late-night networking meetings. The way Martha had pushed to help organize Mom's belongings after the funeral, insisting I was too overcome with grief to handle it properly. The mysterious disappearance of some of Mom's paintings, just being cleaned and reframed, Martha had assured me. When I pulled up to the house, Martha was waiting on the porch like she owned the place. Maybe, in her mind, she did. Her silver hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, her casual outfit probably costing more than my entire wardrobe. "Erin, dear," she called out, all sugary concern as I slammed my car door. "Daniel said you were upset. Let's talk about this rationally." I walked past her into the house, my house, the scent of Mom's favorite lavender candles noticeably absent. Instead, Martha's cloying perfume hung in the air. I headed straight for the studio, my heart pounding with each step on the familiar hardwood floors. The room still smelled like oil paints and turpentine, but something was off. The furniture had been rearranged, and Mom's easel was missing. Her work table had been cleared of the organized chaos she'd always maintained, replaced with Martha's idea of order, everything in neat, soulless rows. I knelt by the window, running my fingers along the floorboards. The loose one was gone, replaced with a new board that didn't quite match the others in color or texture. "We had to fix it," Martha said from the doorway, her voice honey-sweet. "It was a safety hazard. But don't worry, we kept everything we found. Your mother's letter mentioned some important documents." She smiled, adjusting the sleeve of her blouse with manicured fingers that had never known a day of hard work. I stood up slowly, fury burning through my veins like acid. "What documents?" "The deed to the house, of course. And the agreement she and I made about shared ownership." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You understand now why we had to take matters into our own hands. We're family, after all." Hotel night revelation. I spent that night in a hotel, ignoring Daniel's calls and trying to make sense of Martha's claims. The room was sterile and impersonal, but somehow more comforting than my own home had become. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone as messages piled up, 8 from Daniel, 3 from my office, and 1 from a number I didn't recognize. The next morning, I did something I should have done weeks ago. I called my mother's lawyer, Thomas. The phone rang 3 times before his familiar gravelly voice answered. "I was wondering when you'd contact me," he said, his voice grave. "I've been trying to reach you about some concerning activity with your mother's accounts." My stomach dropped, the coffee I'd just swallowed threatening to make a reappearance. "What kind of activity?" Someone's been attempting to access her safety deposit box using an old power of attorney document. The bank flagged it as suspicious since the document appeared to be dated after your mother's death. I gripped my phone tighter, pacing the small hotel room. Let me guess, Martha Prescott. You know about this, he said. It wasn't a question. I'm learning more every day. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. Thomas, I need to know, did my mother ever make any agreement about shared ownership of the house with Martha? Absolutely not. His voice sharpened, the professional veneer giving way to genuine concern. In fact, your mother specifically amended her will 3 months before her death to ensure the house would be solely yours. She was quite insistent about keeping the Prescotts away from her property. I closed my eyes, remembering Mom's letter. Sometimes the people closest to us have the most to gain from our silence. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, forming a picture so ugly I could barely bring myself to look at it. Aaron, Thomas continued, his voice gentler now, there's something else. Your mother left specific instructions about the contents of her studio. She said you'd know where to look. The floorboards have been replaced, I said, sinking onto the bed. Whatever was there is gone. Then we have a serious problem. Those documents weren't just about the house. Before he could explain further, my phone buzzed with a text from Daniel, coming to the hotel. We need to talk. Found something you should see. My heart leapt despite everything, a treacherous part of me still hoping for an explanation that could salvage something from the wreckage of trust. I have to go, I told Thomas, but I need copies of everything, the will, the amendments, all of it. I'll send them right over. And Aaron, be careful, he added, his usually steady voice wavering slightly. Your mother was worried about. About what? About how far certain people would go to protect their interests. The warning hung in the air between us like smoke, impossible to grasp yet impossible to ignore. Daniel's arrival. 20 minutes later, Daniel knocked on my hotel room door. When I opened it, he looked terrible, like he hadn't slept all night. Deep lines bracketed his mouth, and his eyes were bloodshot behind his glasses. For a moment, I felt that old instinct to comfort him, to smooth his rumpled shirt and make everything better. I tamped it down ruthlessly. Before you say anything, he started, pulling out a folder from his messenger bag. You need to see these. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, of my mother and Martha together, shopping, having lunch, looking like close friends. The most recent ones were dated just weeks before Mom died. See? Daniel's voice was almost pleading, his finger tapping one of the photos where the two women appeared to be laughing together at an outdoor cafe. They were friends. Mom wasn't lying about that. I picked up one photo, studying it carefully. The date stamp read just 2 weeks before Mom's death, when she had been so weak she could barely leave the house. These are fake. What? No. He shook his head emphatically. Mom found them in Jean's desk. Mom broke her wrist 6 months before she died. She wore a brace for weeks. I held up the supposedly recent photo. No brace. And her hair was different by then, shorter, after the chemo. These are old photos, probably from years ago, digitally dated to look recent. Daniel's face fell, the hope draining away like water down a sink. But Mom said, your mother is trying to steal my house, Daniel. My voice cracked with the weight of the realization. She forged documents, broke in, and took whatever my mom left in that studio, and you've been helping her. They needed somewhere to live, he said, running both hands through his hair. The foreclosure. Stop. I held up my hand, unable to bear any more excuses. Just stop lying. I talked to Thomas. Mom specifically changed her will to keep your family away from the house. She knew something like this would happen. Aaron, please. His voice broke, tears welling in his eyes. They're still my parents. We can figure something out. Maybe they could rent a room, just until there is no we anymore. The words came out with surprising steadiness, given how my world was collapsing around me. You chose your side the moment you started emptying our accounts behind my back. His expression hardened, the vulnerability replaced by something colder. Fine, then you should know Mom found documents in the studio, legal papers that prove she has a claim to the house. If you force this, it'll get ugly. It's already ugly. I opened the door, no longer able to look at the stranger wearing my husband's face. Tell your mother she has 24 hours to get out of my house before I file charges for breaking and entering, theft, and fraud. You wouldn't. The disbelief in his voice might have been comical under different circumstances. I met his eyes one last time. Try me. Legal discovery. After he left, I checked my email. Thomas had sent the old documents along with a cryptic message, found something interesting in your mother's old financial records. Call me ASAP. My phone buzzed again, another text from Daniel. Mom says to remember what happened to the paintings. I froze, suddenly understanding with crystal clarity. The missing artwork. The forged documents. The desperate attempts to access Mom's safety deposit box. This wasn't just about the house. This was about what my mother had hidden and what the Prescotts would do to get it. I called Thomas immediately, and 30 minutes later I was walking into his office, the weight of revelation making each step heavier than the last. Thomas's office was a maze of filing cabinets and leather-bound books, a testament to his 40 years of legal practice. But what caught my attention was the painting on his wall, one of my mother's landscapes that had gone missing from her studio, a sunset over the lake where we'd spent summers when I was a child. Martha sold it to me last week, he said, following my gaze. His white hair and lined face seemed to have aged years since I'd last seen him at the funeral. Said she was handling the estate sale. I knew something wasn't right. I sank into the chair across from his desk, the leather cool against my back. What did you find in the financial records? He pulled out a thick folder, his arthritis-gnarled fingers working with practiced efficiency. Your mother was investigating Richard Prescott's old engineering firm, specifically their involvement in a series of construction projects that collapsed 10 years ago. 3 people died. My hands started shaking. What does that have to do with my mother? She was an artist, yes, but she also did forensic accounting work before retiring, as you know, Thomas said, his voice steady but grim. She found evidence of fraudulent inspections, falsified safety reports, all signed off by Richard. The pieces started falling into place, a terrible puzzle assembling itself before my eyes. That's what she hid in the studio, proof of their corruption. And now they're desperate to find it. Thomas leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. The statute of limitations on criminal charges has expired, but civil suits, those could still bankrupt them. My phone buzzed. Daniel again, we need to talk. Found a solution. Everyone can live with. They're trying to make a deal, I said, showing Thomas the message. Thomas's expression darkened. Be careful. People who've covered up deaths once won't hesitate to do it again. I stood up, smoothing my skirt with trembling hands. I need copies of everything. Already done. He handed me a USB drive. But Aaron, there's more. Your mother's safety deposit box, it doesn't contain documents. It contains a key to a storage unit. Before I could respond, another text came through, this time from an unknown number. Your mother should have minded her own business. Like mother, like daughter. I showed Thomas the message. His face went pale, the wrinkles around his mouth deepening into crevices. Your mother's death wasn't investigated thoroughly, he said quietly. The medical examiner ruled it natural causes, but... But what? My voice came out as barely more than a whisper. She left me a letter too. Said if anything happened to her, I should look closer at her medication. The world tilted sideways. I gripped the edge of his desk, the polished wood smooth beneath my fingers, as memories flashed through my mind. Martha helping during Mom's final weeks, organizing her pills, bringing her food, insisting on being there when the hospice nurse visited. Are you saying? I couldn't finish the sentence, the horror of it sticking in my throat like a bone. Thomas merely nodded, his eyes full of sorrow. My phone rang. Daniel again. This time I answered. Come home, he said without preamble. Mom has a proposition. We can fix this. Fix what? My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and hollow. The fraud? The theft? Or my mother's murder? There was a long pause, only the sound of breathing on the line. What are you talking about? Ask your parents about the construction projects, I said, my grip on the phone so tight my knuckles turned white. Ask them what really happened to my mother. Aaron, you're not thinking clearly. His voice took on that patronizing tone that had always made my teeth clench. Just come home. We can work this out as a family. Family? I laughed, the sound bordering on hysteria. Your family killed my mother. That's a serious accusation, a new voice said, Martha's, listening in. Be very careful about what you say next, dear. Grief can make people imagine terrible things. I thought about Mom's letter, her warning about trust, her final weeks of illness that had seemed to progress so rapidly. 24 hours, I said, my voice steadier now despite the tremor in my hands. Get out of my house and return everything you took, or I'm going to the police with everything I have. You have nothing, Martha snapped, dropping her sweet facade like a discarded coat. And if you're smart, you'll keep it that way. Some accidents are easier to arrange than others. The line went dead. I looked at Thomas, my hands still shaking but my mind suddenly clear, as if a fog had lifted. I need a forensic team at the house, I said, and I need to access that storage unit before they do. They'll be watching you. Thomas warned. Let them. I pulled out my mother's letter, reading it again. Sometimes the people closest to us have the most to gain from our silence. I'm done being quiet. As I left his office, my phone buzzed one last time. Daniel, don't make me choose between you and my family. I typed back 4 words, you already did. Goodbye. Then I turned off my phone and headed for the storage facility. It was time to finish what my mother started. Final confrontation, the storage unit key felt heavy in my pocket, like it was made of lead instead of brass. As I pulled up to my mother's house, something was wrong. The front door stood slightly open, and Daniel's car wasn't the only one in the driveway. Richard's truck loomed like a threat, its massive chrome grille catching the afternoon sunlight. I called Thomas. They're here. The police are on their way. Don't go inside. But through the window, I could see them ransacking Mom's studio. Martha was pulling books from shelves while Richard attacked the walls with a hammer, looking for hidden compartments. And Daniel. Daniel was going through Mom's remaining paintings with a box cutter, systematically slicing through canvas after canvas. The sight of my mother's work being destroyed ignited something primal in me. I was through the door before I could stop myself, rage propelling me forward. Get away from those. My voice echoed through the house. They all froze. Daniel dropped the box cutter, looking guilty, but Richard and Martha's expressions were different, calculated, dangerous. Aaron, Martha said smoothly, brushing dust from her expensive sweater, we were just doing some renovations. By destroying my mother's art? My voice shook with fury. Or are you looking for more evidence of Richard's negligence? How many people died because of those falsified reports? Richard stepped forward, his imposing figure suddenly menacing in the afternoon light that streamed through the windows. You don't know what you're talking about. 3 families lost people they loved because you cut corners, I said, standing my ground despite the fear curling in my stomach. And when my mother figured it out. She should have kept her mouth shut, Martha snapped, her designer facade cracking to reveal the harshness beneath, just like you should. Daniel moved between us, his hands raised placatingly. Everyone needs to calm down. Aaron, we can work this out. Just tell us what's in the storage unit. The betrayal hit like a physical blow. You followed me to Thomas's office. We had to, he said, almost pleading. You're not thinking clearly. This could ruin everyone's lives. Your father already ruined lives, I shot back, my voice rising. And your mother. I turned to Martha, rage burning through my fear. What did you put in her medication? How long did you plan it? Careful, dear, Martha's voice turned ice cold, all pretense of warmth gone. Accusations like that could be dangerous. Grief can make people unstable. Accidents happen. Is that what happened to my mother? An accident? Richard stepped closer, his height allowing him to loom over me. Where's the storage unit key? The police are on their way, I bluffed, taking a step back. No, they're not, Daniel said quietly. I saw you make that call. You're bluffing. The walls seemed to close in. I backed toward the door, but Richard was faster. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in painfully. The key, he demanded. Now. Let her go, Daniel said, but his voice was weak, uncertain. Stay out of this, Richard snapped at his son. You've done enough damage letting her run wild like this. I twisted free, but Martha was behind me, blocking the exit. Think about Daniel, she said. Do you really want to destroy his family? Just give us the key and this can all go away. Like my mother went away? I asked, watching her face closely. Something shifted in her eyes, not guilt, but satisfaction. She made her choice, just like you're making yours. I reached into my pocket, felt the key's metal edges. One move could end this. Give them what they wanted. Walk away. Pretend none of this happened. Save what was left of my safety, my life. But I saw my mother's paintings in shreds on the floor, saw the hammer holes in her studio walls, remembered her final weeks growing weaker while Martha helped with her medication. I thought about the 3 families who had lost loved ones because of Richard's greed. I pulled out my phone instead of the key. What are you doing? Richard demanded, his voice sharp with panic. Sending evidence to every news outlet in the state, I said, my fingers flying over the screen. Mom's findings. Thomas's investigation. Proof of your fraud. Richard lunged. The phone went flying. I heard it crack against the wall as his hands closed around my throat. Dad, stop. Daniel's shout seemed far away through the roaring in my ears. Get the key. Richard growled, his fingers tightening. Martha's hands were in my pockets. As I struggled to breathe, she pulled out the key with a triumphant cry. Richard released me. I collapsed, gasping, as they rushed out. The sound of car engines starting filled the air. Daniel stood frozen, looking between me and the door. Help me, I wheezed, my throat burning. He took a step back, his face a mask of conflict. I'm sorry, he whispered. Then he was gone too, leaving me alone in my mother's ruined studio, surrounded by the wreckage of everything I'd believed in. My phone lay shattered nearby, the evidence unsent. And somewhere across town, they were heading for a storage unit that contained nothing but empty boxes. Because my mother had taught me well, sometimes the best revenge is letting your enemies think they've won. The real evidence was somewhere else entirely, and now I knew exactly what I had to do with it. The gallery reveal, the storage unit was empty, just as I'd planned. But I wasn't at the police station, where they'd expect me to go next. Instead, I stood in the gallery where my mother had held her last show, watching through the windows as Daniel's car pulled up outside. They'd figure it out soon enough, Mom's real evidence wasn't in a storage unit or hidden under floorboards. It was hanging right here, hidden in plain sight. I straightened my jacket and touched my bruised throat gently. The pain was a reminder of what was at stake. Martha burst through the door first, her face flushed with rage, silver hair disheveled for once. "Where is it?" she demanded, eyes darting around the gallery's white walls. "Look around," I said, gesturing to the paintings on the walls with a calmness I didn't entirely feel. Mom always said art reveals truth if you know how to look. Richard stormed in behind her, followed by Daniel. "Stop playing games," Richard growled, his earlier composure completely abandoned. "Not playing," I replied, walking to the largest painting, the one Mom had finished just before she died. It hung prominently on the far wall, illuminated by carefully positioned gallery lights. Did you ever wonder why she insisted this piece stay in the gallery? Why she made sure it was properly insured? They stared at the canvas, a seemingly abstract swirl of colors and shapes. But hidden within the chaos were documents, photographs, numbers. Mom had turned Richard's fraud into art, embedding the evidence in layers of paint and texture. Only someone who knew what to look for would see it: the building specifications, the falsified safety reports, the dates of inspections that never happened. "That's nothing but colors," Martha scoffed, but her voice shook. "You can't prove anything with this." "The insurance company's forensic team disagrees," I said, a small smile playing at my lips. "They've already documented everything." "And the original documents," I continued, watching their faces carefully, "are currently being reviewed by the district attorney." Richard lunged for the painting. I stepped between them. "Touch it and the alarm triggers. Police response time is 3 minutes. "You're bluffing," Daniel said, "like you were bluffing about the police before." "Check your phone," I suggested, nodding toward the device in his hand. "The story is already breaking." They all pulled out their phones, and I watched their faces as they saw the headlines: "Fatal construction collapse, new evidence reveals cover-up." Thomas had come through, just as I knew he would. "You've destroyed this family," Martha hissed, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms. "No," I replied, the weight of truth straightening my spine. "You did that when you killed my mother." "You can't prove that," she said, but her hands were shaking, betraying her certainty. "Actually, I can. Mom documented her symptoms, had her blood tested privately. The results were part of what she hid in the studio until you found them." I watched understanding dawn on her face. "That's why you rushed to get rid of her paintings, wasn't it? Afraid she'd hidden more evidence in her art." Richard grabbed Martha's arm. "We need to go. Now." "Running won't help," I said. "The police have already shut down the airport and train stations." Richard spun toward me, his control finally snapping. "You think you're so clever. Your mother thought the same thing, right up until the end." Daniel stepped between us. "Dad, stop." "Move," Richard growled, looking every bit the bully he'd always been beneath his respectable veneer. "No." Daniel's voice was quiet but firm. "I've helped cover up enough." Martha's face contorted with fury. "After everything we've done for you." "You killed her mother," Daniel said, the words cutting through the air like glass. "You've been bleeding us dry for months, and now I find out about the construction deaths. When does it end?" "It ends now," I said, as police sirens filled the air. Through the gallery windows, I could see officers taking position. "The gallery is surrounded." "Has been since he walked in," I said, nodding toward Richard. Richard made one last grab for the painting. Daniel caught his arm, wrestling him back as officers flooded through the doors. I watched them lead Richard and Martha away in handcuffs, their rights being read over Martha's protests and Richard's threats. Daniel stood apart, looking lost, the middle-aged son of criminals, the husband who had chosen poorly. He approached me hesitantly. I didn't know, he said quietly, about your mom, about any of it. I should have. But you didn't want to know, I finished. That's why we're done. Aaron. His voice cracked on my name. The divorce papers are with my lawyer, I said, turning away from his stricken face. Along with evidence of the money you took from our accounts. Some things can't be fixed. 25 years of marriage ended in a week of revelations. As the gallery cleared out, I stood alone before my mother's final painting. Up close, you could see the truth hidden in every brushstroke, not just the evidence of Richard's crimes, but a message from Mom herself worked into the pattern. The truth always comes to light. She'd known they'd kill her for discovering their secret, but she'd made sure the truth wouldn't die with her. She'd turned it into art, knowing I'd understand eventually. I touched the canvas gently. I get it now, Mom, I whispered to the silent gallery. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying your enemies, it's about making sure they can't destroy the truth. Behind me, the gallery doors closed on the sound of sirens, marking the end of one story and the beginning of another. Epilogue. 6 months after the arrests, I stood in my mother's studio, finally ready to repair the damage. The holes in the walls had been patched, the broken floorboards replaced. But I'd left her paintings untouched, their torn edges a reminder of how quickly things can unravel. The trial was set for spring. Richard and Martha had pleaded not guilty, but the evidence Mom had woven into her art was damning. 3 families from the construction collapse had joined the civil suit, their years of silence finally broken. I picked up a torn canvas, running my fingers along its jagged edge. The damage couldn't be undone, but perhaps something new could emerge from it. The doorbell rang. Daniel stood on the porch, looking older somehow. The past 6 months had etched new lines around his mouth, added more gray to his temples. The divorce papers are signed, he said, holding out an envelope. You could have mailed them. I wanted to return this, he replied, holding out a small key, the one to Mom's house. And to tell you I'm testifying against them. The DA offered a deal. I took the key without touching his hand, the metal cool against my palm. Why now? I asked, genuinely curious. Because your mother deserved better. You deserved better. He shifted uncomfortably on the porch, the spring breeze ruffling his hair. They found more evidence in Dad's old files, other projects, other cover-ups. How many? Too many. He turned to leave, then stopped. I'm sorry, I wasn't stronger. I watched him walk away for the last time, feeling nothing but a quiet certainty that I'd made the right choice. The man I had married wouldn't have needed to find strength, he would have stood by my side from the beginning. Back in the studio, I noticed something odd about the newly patched wall, a slight discoloration near the baseboard. Kneeling down, I pressed against it. A small panel popped open. Inside was a leather-bound journal and another letter in Mom's handwriting. My dearest Aaron, if you're reading this, you've already learned the hard truth about strength, that it often comes from standing alone. The journal contains everything I couldn't put into my paintings, but more importantly, it contains the story of how I learned to stand up for myself. You'll find the deed to the gallery in here too. I bought it years ago under a different name. It's yours now. The Prescotts never knew about it. Some secrets are meant to protect, not harm. Remember, art isn't just about beauty. Sometimes it's about showing the world what others try to hide. All my love, Mom. I opened the journal, recognizing the names of other construction projects, other families who'd lost loved ones. Mom hadn't just documented Richard's crimes, she'd created a record of every voice that had been silenced. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. 3 more families have come forward. You were right about the pattern. I looked around the studio, at the torn paintings, the patched walls, the hidden panel that had protected truth when everything else fell apart. Then I pulled out my laptop and started typing. My name is Aaron Calloway, and this is a story about justice. Not the kind that comes from revenge, but the kind that comes from refusing to stay silent. The words flowed easily now, telling not just my story, or my mother's, but all the stories that had been buried under years of manipulation and fear. The manuscript would take months to complete, but I had time. The truth had waited this long, it deserved to be told right. Later that evening, I hung one of Mom's restored paintings in the gallery, not the one that had exposed Richard's crimes, but a smaller piece I'd never fully understood before. It showed a woman standing alone in a storm, her face turned toward the light breaking through clouds. The plaque beneath it read, "Strength by Jean Calloway." As I locked up the gallery, my phone buzzed again, an unknown number. "You're just like your mother. This isn't over." I smiled, thinking of the journal in my bag, the manuscript on my laptop, and all the stories yet to be told. "No," I whispered to the empty gallery, "it's just beginning." Because Mom was right, some secrets protect, others destroy. The trick is knowing which ones to keep and which ones need to be transformed into art for the whole world to see. I turned off the lights, leaving the painting of the woman in the storm glowing softly in the darkness, her face still turned toward the breaking light.